everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. The Drought of 1909. Hello there. Have you noticed what a dry autumn we're having? The smoke from the forest fires remind us that the things begin to get dusty when the rain stops falling on a regular schedule. If we have a tradition here for weather, it's bound up in rainfall. Hometow has tied a major public event to it, as important and not too different from the annual ice breakup in Alaska. And our rainfall, the drizzles, drips, and deluges, it's important to our region. For one thing, the rain produces the timber that is the backlog of our economy. It makes the trees of Grays Harbor grow faster than any place in the United States except western Mason County up near Oxbow. And the only place in the world where trees grow faster is in the tropics. It also gives our forest the name, the rainforest, and was once responsible for the theory that our forest could never burn, as the forest in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota have done in the great fires of the 1880s. The rain made it possible to log our forest of big trees. The ox teams would never have been able to snake those 7 or 8 foot firs out of the forest on the upper reaches of our valley without the many rivers that cut into the hinterlands. But the logger's paradise that early timbermen knew had made complete by hump tulips, the Hoquiam, Wishkah, Chehalis, Johns, Elk, and other rivers that floated the big trees down to the tidewater mills. Yes, the good wet rains that fell on us made Grays Harbor the place it is. But they haven't always fallen the same. And that's how we get around to tonight's story. The tale of the drought of 1909. That's right, we said drought. And it produced some phenomena that sound like the Dust Bowl stories in the telling. And as usual, before we get into the yarn tonight, we're going to pull up here and have Dick Crombie say a few words from our sponsor. Now, Grays Harbor has a pretty consistent fall of rain. We think it's too much, the point with anguish to some of the years when the drip of our caves total up to more than 100 inches. But over the years, we've had some pretty low scores on our precipitation. Take 1929, for example. The year that the wells of commerce suddenly dried up, the rain set a record low for Grays Harbor. Our downpours amounted to less than 50 inches, to be exact, 49.8 inches of rain. That was the lowest recorded rainfall for our spot on the earth. In fact, that's more than 8 inches below the next lowest rainfall. The next closest was 1944, when we had just 57.5 inches. Usually we can expect from 70 to 80 inches. And under that insistent pattern, our forests grow fast, our reservoirs stay full, and our people keep their good health and sense of humor. Back in 1909, we had a year that upset the dope bucket. When we look at the records, it appears to have been a pretty wet year, and actually it was as years went. But it was also the year of the big drought. Now, 1909 started out with the usual sort of weather. The people of the harbor slogged along through about 14 inches of the stuff in January, and another 14 inches went down the drain pipes in February, and March was about normal. But April, it began to taper off. We had only a couple of inches, and then in May, just a little over 4 inches. For that time of year, it was pretty dry. In fact, in only one other year had April rainfall dropped so low, and that was the year when February and March had pretty near washed the trees out of the ground, and it had to let up in April, or the cities would have been washed out into the ocean. Well, with 14 inches totaled up for each of the first 2 months of the year, old June Pulvis, who comes about as near to a patron saint as Grace Harbor has, set down his rain bucket and dozed off for half a year. In the 6 months, Grace Harbor had only a little more than 13 inches of rain. To give you a comparison, that is about half of what we had last year for the same 6 months. And last year's rainfall fell below that of 1909 by a full 11 inches. In other words, last year was comparatively dry, yet it had double the rainfall for April through September than that of the summer of 1909. Well, we're getting sort of wound up in statistics. Let's just finish that off by saying that it was a terrifically dry summer that mid-year of 1909. From the Straits to the Columbia, things began to dry up. The forest fires came months earlier than usual, and clouds of smoke come over the Olympic Peninsula like a heavy storm. In the woods, camps worked a split shift from daylight until mid-morning and from mid-afternoon until dark. Mills put on special fire crews to watch for sparks. Sawdust fires in the harbor cities kept the volunteer fire departments on the jump, and the pay department in Aberdeen earned its salary that summer with about a fire a day for a while. Bush fires, sawdust fires, house and sawmill fires, something all the time. Reservoirs began to fall below the danger line, and the lawn sprinklers, too, became taboo. The city water department went about town looking for running taps. The public drinking fountain in front of the George W. Wolfe Company store, a proud gift to the city by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was shut off. Garden tracts just dried up and blew away. Streams fell so low that many of the logging firms in the woods could no longer use their booms, and they began to pile logs in the mud to await the return of the water to the rivers and the sloughs. The loggers were determined to keep the camps running on schedule, rain or no rain. The rain problem became so acute that some of the churches held special services to pray for rain. It was the sort of thing that was associated with the Dust Bowl, hardly with Grace Harbor any season of the year. But each morning the sun came up and baked the little towns, and nothing much happened until the cool of the night or the afternoon breeze slipped in. What little rain fell came and evaporated as suddenly, leaving the woods and lawns and the reservoirs just about as empty as they have ever been. By September, the rainfall for 5 months was below a dozen inches, and the sea breeze began to carry dust from dry tidelands, dry sawdust, and other powdered dry particulates, along with the usual cinders and salt. By the end of September, the situation was critical, but the advent of October, there were a few showers that relieved things temporarily, and things seemed to be getting back to normal. However, the few showers that fell failed to lift the rivers. The rain soaked right into the parched earth and was absorbed by the trees. The 7 inches that splashed over the harbor in that month hardly wet the place down thoroughly. So dry had the summer been. And then came November. Now you and I know that if it's going to rain here at all, November is the month. Yes, that month has a reputation hereabouts of being able to lay it down with the best of them. And that November did. It saw more rain than any other November in local history. In fact, it set a record for rainfall equally by only 1 month in our recorded history, that of December 1933, the year of the Big Flood, exceeded the November rains of 1909. But that was almost a month of record. One day it was just beginning to moisten up, and the next it began to pour with vengeance. And throughout the month it kept right on working it. Well, you know what happened, even if you didn't happen to be getting your mail on Grace Harbor at that time. When it began to pour on the night of the last day of October, it dampened down the Halloween celebrations, Incidentally, the streams began to come back to normal. By November 2nd, that was Tuesday, Jupulvis was really at work. A 75-mile-an-hour gale swept in from the coast with a driving rain such as old-timers can hardly recall being equaled. Night and day it came down, sheets of water fell, streams began to boil, swell, overflow their banks, and walls of water began to pour down the ravines. While the piles of logs that had been stacked in the mud, the hump tulips, the Wishkon, the Hoquiam rivers, came down the raging streams, pell-mell for open waters. In some places, booms went out and rafts that had been formed were broken, and their logs joined the whitewater drive for the harbor. The driving gale kept the boom men off the Chehalis in the upper harbor, and logs came floating downstream in a tumble-jumble of bouncing timber that at times made almost a solid footing across the upper Chehalis River. The first big bridge to stand in the way of the floating logs on the Chehalis was Railroad Bridge at Junction City, and the logs began to hang up on the dolphins of the substructure of the span. For a time, railroad men and rivermen alike feared for the structure. Men and tugs worked all night long and into the next day dislodging the log jam, and as fast as they would cut them loose from a wild scramble of logs and piling them, then they would come bouncing down the harbor with a new group. The incoming tide threw up a virtual wall of floating logs across the lower harbor, and the outgoing tide spewed them out of the harbor's mouth and scattered them along the coast. North and south beaches were littered with the timber, some of the finest fir that the harbor had ever cut, and salvage operations were started the first day the weather permitted. Logging firms estimated that more than 8 million feet of timber had been washed up on the beaches where it was impractical to salvage with the equipment they used at that time. But many times that amount was floated off to the beaches and into the inner harbors as tugs rounded up the individual logs and bunched them into rafts and small packages for return to the booms. No one ever could figure how much of the summer's logging cut had gone to sea to end up on the Oregon coast or to disappear from local waters altogether. But the loss of timber was heavy. However, the drought was broken with a vengeance, and things snapped back to normal on Grays Harbor, with reservoirs full of running over, lawns green again, and everyone feeling normal with water running down their necks and the ducks feeling at home hereabouts. Yes, that was one year that the weathermen threw the book at us. A 6-month drought followed by a flood. It was one that makes good telling today, but it caused a lot of trouble back there in 1909. And before we have our last words, let's bring back Dick Crombie with a word from our sponsor. The weather on Grays Harbor has been making news for as long as white men have bothered to keep a record of what rain and sunshine, winds and snow. And just for the sake of keeping the record straight, let's take a look at the rain chart for some of those long ago years. There's a lot of good storytelling in some of those figures. It might be hard to believe, but there are a few months in our history when no rain fell at all. July 1922, for example. It was completely dry. So was July 1919. We once had a November when only 1.5 inches of rain fell. It was in 1936. But most of our records are for the most rainfall, and in that category we have some beauties. Take 1939, we had one of the 2 floods of that decade. The November rainfall that year was second only to the deluge that came in 1909, the years we've been warning about. And that was a skookum year for totals too. It went to 108.25 inches that year. But that isn't the top figure for our neighborhood. Oh no. We did better than 108 inches on 2 separate occasions, and those years came in succession. That was probably the all-around wettest era in the harbor's damp history. In 1931, we topped 100 inches for the first time in the 20th century. The next year, in 1932, we pushed the score up to 110.93. And the next year, the wettest year of all, we set the top mark at 113.4 inches, which I'm sure we all hope will remain the record for all the time to come. But one thing about confirmed Grays Harborites: if it's raining, and that's the normal state for our little region, we know that things are going to be all right, the way they ought to be. And it has, over the years, selected our population for us. Someone once remarked that the people who live in Grays Harbor are a superior race. They're a cut above the rest of the Homo sapiens. They don't mind the rain because they carry their sunshine inside them. Well, that's as it is to be. If any event, our scrapbook would be as empty ton without the yarns about the rains that keep our hills and valleys green. And that's the yarn. Thank you for listening.